And we're live, broadcasting from the shadows of New York City. My name is Jason Tramm, and this is Music Matters, and we're delighted you can join us for our unique podcast community, where we explore the issues and challenges of the musical world as seen through the eyes of distinguished colleagues. We're so delighted to have performers, artists, scholars, and authors. And today we have a wonderful author for you today, Howard J. Smith. And a reminder to subscribe to us on YouTube and hit that bell icon for the most up-to-date information and upcoming guests and topics. Like and share our videos on social media. We really appreciate that as we are a growing community. And we're delighted to have new people join us all the time. Don't forget that you can chat in questions of our guests or me, and that if you want to join the conversation, we love it when our audience joins in this conversation about the arts. And join our mailing list. If you go on my website at www.jasontram, you can see our past 90, actually this is our 90th episode tonight, our past 89 and now 90th episodes. And you can learn so much about what artists and creative people are doing during this really challenging time for everyone. So thank you for joining us on Music Matters, and welcome to author Howard J. Smith.
Thank you, Jason. Delighted to be here today and looking forward to a fun conversation.
Joining us from Santa Barbara. How's the weather in Santa Barbara today?
It is actually an absolutely gorgeous day. It's about 75 degrees, perfectly sunny. If I wasn't on the phone with you, I'd probably be cutting out early and heading over to walk and hike on the beach.
Well, we're in a gray, I think 30s in New York today. It's about right, but we've had very little snow, so little to complain about. So we always dream about California at this time of year, certainly.
I moved from the East Coast 35 years ago. I never want to go back. No snow, no humidity, and lots of clear sunny days.
So Howard, you have a really diverse and interesting background. Why don't you take us through and how you came, your artistic journey, and how you came to write these two wonderful novels we're going to talk about today?
Well, I begin by saying first, I've always been a writer. Even in elementary school, I was telling stories. In college, I was writing. I was lucky enough as a young man to get into the Breadloaf Writers Program at Middlebury College on 3 different occasions. I got to work as a student with people like Toni Morrison, John Irving, the novelist Tim O'Brien, and most importantly, the novelist John Gardner. John became my mentor and my teacher for about the next 5 years. We worked on a couple of projects together, did a lot of articles related to his radio shows that he was doing at that time. This is, again, talking the early 80s, just before he died. And I'd always sought to be a novelist and a writer. I won a number of awards when I was back in DC, from the DC Arts and Humanities Commission, from Georgetown University, from the Jenny McKee and Moore program. Actually, that was GW. So this was my background. And I saw an opportunity in the early 80s to head out to Hollywood to do and become a screenwriter. And someone had visited one of the workshops I was in and said, you know, here you guys are struggling to write a novel, 300-400 pages. I write 26 pages with a lot of white space, and that's a sitcom, and I get paid a lot of money and residuals for that. Just as a side note, I wrote an episode of Who's the Boss in 1989. I still get residual checks.
Wow.
Even 4 or 5 figures if you count the 2 on the far side of the decimal point. But, it was a very well-paying, potentially, career. So I came out to California in the mid-'80s, studied at the American Film Institute. I was considered the top screenwriting student at the time, used to rewrite a lot of other people's work. And within a few months of graduating, I ended up at ABC TV as an exec in low level, in the bottom rung of the drama series development department. Spent a couple of years doing that, then moved over to Embassy TV, where we were doing a lot of sitcoms. This was Norman Lear's old company. Norman had just left when I got there, but I worked with all of Norman's people, which also made it one of the more wonderful places to work. But eventually, as what happens in Hollywood, is a good company that does well gets bought up by somebody else. Coca-Cola bought up Embassy in Colombia. A few years later, they merged the 2 companies, and they got rid of my department at Embassy and ended up out of a job for a while, but was, again, lucky enough that I got my first gig writing screenplays at that point for hire, along with a partner. We did 3 together. And again, one of the things you have to know about Hollywood is professional writers spend most of their careers writing work and getting paid for it that never sees the light of day. We did our first project was a screenplay about the Tuskegee Airmen. There have been 2 movies made about them in the 35 years since. Neither one was our script. We kept being really close, but no banana. And again, I went through the writer's strike in Hollywood, which for those of you artists, one of the great lessons of that strike was it was a year out of our lives. Firms laid people off a good 3 to 6 months before the strike, knowing that there would be no work done. The strike itself was 6 months, and it took another 3 months to get back up to gear. Within a month after the end of that strike, I managed to, in 1 week, deliver my episode of Who's the Boss, deliver another screenplay sold to Columbia Pictures, and a TV melodrama to NBC Productions, all in 1 week. I did not have enough cash on hand to go out to dinner to celebrate, though, because those checks were very much delayed. So you never knew. And that business was up and down. The strike, because it lasted a year, most of the writers I knew who were essentially working stiffs had to find other gigs to survive, had to do other things. I even drove a limo for a month during that time. Also did a lot of commercial production work. My partner in writing at that time, a guy named Mike Dugan, Mike had trained in commercial production. And so we worked, you name the commercial, we worked on it at one point or another. I used to be an off-camera interviewer. I did kind of what you did, except you never saw my face. You would see the governor or the head of Vons shopping or the head of the state lottery talking or interviews, but they're actually talking to me as I'm wedged literally under the camera. It was not a bad day gig, but it was not a career and it didn't pay well. I then ended up teaching for 5 years at UCLA Extension, both in the screenwriters program and in the fiction program. And after that, I did a lot of work in business, finance. And it was only about 10 years ago that I decided I had the opportunity and the finances to go back and write novels.
And what's it like as someone who's trained to write novels and to work as a screenwriter for so long in Hollywood, and then to go back to your love of novels? What do you bring with you when you go there?
Well, again, one of the things you have to know about screenwriting is when you're writing a script, the script itself is a question mark to a potential producer, and you're asking that producer to spend $50 to $100 million on something you've written. You don't want anything in there that doesn't need to be there. Script writing is very economical. It's very quick. You get into scenes as quick as you can. You get out of them as quick as you can. And you always need to keep the drama going. Those are lessons that are completely applicable to writing a novel. I tend to be a lyric novelist. I'm very concerned about the sound of words, the flow of language. Every novel I've ever written, I've always read out loud to somebody all the way through to get those rhythms. But the economy of screenwriting is really critical. And it's a great lesson. Almost every writer should at one point, who wants to write fiction, should learn the rules of screenwriting. Because you don't describe things in a novel you don't need to describe. You don't put stuff in there just to have stuff. I think, as I mentioned earlier, if I had a character who was eating a certain food, it's because that meal, even the very recipe for that food, is going to play out 2 to 3 times more in that novel. There's nothing in any of my books that is not there for a specific reason and will not have a reverberation somewhere else in the novel and be significant and important to the plot.
I love how this compares to music. If you take a look at the great Beethoven symphonies or any of the great composers, the balance and the form, the use of motives, the connection between movements as we get to the late classical to the romantic period, it's all there.
I think there's a huge amount that, I mean, I'm not a musician, but I know from talking to many composers, musicians, that a good novel and a good story is very similar to writing a good composition. It has a theme. It has side stories, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, and you're always driving towards some place. It doesn't just happen, and you don't just put a lot of notes together. Writing is the same thing. It's not a collection of words, it's not how many words you write, it's how each word participates in telling the story you want the reader to get. And everything you write is a communication to the reader of what you want them to see, to feel, to believe. And also I had to sort of bring this back to emotions. When I was back in film school, and again, writing my textbook about it, Opening Doors to Hollywood, one of the people I got to work with was the film director, Robert Wise, who had done The Sound of Music, West Side Story, as well as infinite numbers of other films. So this is a man who knew music, knew how to create with music. And he said very simply, a novel is about what people think in their head. A play is about what people say to each other. A movie is about what people see, to which I'll add an opera, which is what I had to really concentrate on. The Mozart book is about what people feel expressed through song. And if you understand that there are four completely different disciplines who could be telling the same story, but you have to tell it in a different way. I'll add too, I despise people who take one form and literally try to transpose it into the other. It doesn't work.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It's not that way. Streetcar Named Desire as an opera is a disaster. If I was hired to do that libretto, I would have said no. Not that I was going to be asked, but I would have said no. Because if you cannot change, and the family did not allow a single change to the play, it's a play. It's about what people say. It's not about the emotions people feel and sing. So it sounds like you have somebody going on about getting a lemon Coke or answering the phone. That's not opera at its best.
Opera's universal human stories, storytelling. It's such a different genre.
Completely different genre. And the stories told also have to work. Mozart is a great opera composer, but Mozart's compositions would have collapsed if it were not for Lorenzo da Ponte, who was his librettist. And da Ponte was a brilliant man, a polymath, as smart and as creative and as much a genius as Mozart was throughout all aspects of his life. He's also a survivor who managed to live out a full 89 years. He brought opera to New York. He was the two opera theaters he created in New York City, where he lived for 33 years, were the forerunner of the Met. He introduced Italian as a language to the upper crust of New York, beginning in 1805. He was a teacher. Also became the first professor of Italian at Columbia University, the first priest to teach there, and coincidentally, the first Jew to teach at Columbia.
We'll put priest in quotation marks. We'll talk about that soon.
Yeah. He was also very good friends with Clement Moore, who wrote The Night Before Christmas. Clement's father was the Episcopal Bishop of New York City, and it was Clement who hired him to be the professor of Italian at Columbia. He knew James Fenimore Cooper, Williams Jennings Bryant. I mean, the list of early modern New York literary and artistic luminaries who were friends with this man. Even Joseph Bonaparte, who was in New York in exile after the war, was a good friend of his. And they all went to the opera with him. And they were all patrons that helped start the operas in New York.
Incredible how his life reaches so many different places. So let's talk about how you were drawn to this topic, and does it, the fact that he was a man of letters, grab your attention? Does it help grab your attention as well?
Oh, absolutely. But I think the thing that struck me most when I was learning about da Ponte, one, he's a fascinating character to begin with. But two, this is a man who was born Emanuele Conliano, an Italian Jew in a northern Italian village not far from Venice. He grows up in an era when people wore capes and masks year-round, not just during Carnival. And at age 14, his father, who had three sons, Lorenzo being the oldest, wanted to remarry. His wife had died during the birth of his youngest child, who was 10 years younger than Lorenzo, and it was a Catholic woman. Well, in order to get permission to do that, he had to convert the entire family to Catholicism. Now, Lorenzo, up to that point, he'd been bar mitzvahed, but he had no real schooling other than a little bit of education by the local rabbi. Had no education. So he begged the bishop who did the conversion, and his name he took, Lorenzo da Ponte, which was the tradition, He said, if I'm going to have to do this, at least let me go to the seminary, let me go to school, let me study. Bishop said, fine. Converso who wants to go to school, great. Well, the route of being in the seminary is to become a priest. De Ponte was a horrible priest. He was
One
not
of the worst.
celibate. He loved women. He was, in his own life, a Casanova, a Don Giovanni early in his life. He gets assigned first, he's teaching at a school north of Venice, and he gets thrown out for being a little too political. He gets reassigned to Venice, to a church. He does confessions on Sunday in the church and does mass. But during the week, he's living with one of his many girlfriends. He's gambling, he's whoring, he's going to the casinos, he's partying, he's dancing. He never once ever focused on the philosophy or the theology of any religion. He just used it to get an education, and that was it.
So he was eventually banished from Venice, correct? And then,
Right.
and then he comes into the Mozart period.
Is a sequence where he keeps getting denounced, usually by the husbands of the women he's having affairs with. And ultimately, he even meets Casanova there and becomes good friends with the real Casanova, who's 20 years his senior, and also shares a lot of his books with him. He gets thrown out of Venice and is forced to run or face jail out of the entire Veneto, which is a large province surrounding Venice. And he makes his way ultimately with a letter of introduction to Salieri in Vienna. Now, De Ponte, in his survival modes in Venice, had become a writer, a scholar, a poet, a versifier. He would write documents for people. He did anything he could to make a living and survive as a writer. So by the time he gets to Vienna, he's actually a fairly good, competent poet. He's written a number of volumes of poetry at this point. And Salieri hires him to be, quote unquote, the court poet for the Habsburg Empire. So here's this kid born into poverty in the ghettos outside Venice. And by the way, he's no longer allowed as a converso to associate with any Jews at the risk of being locked up, jailed, or sent to the galleys. He could be killed for that. It's a crime punishable because the church did not want people backsliding. You have to keep in mind that the church and the civil authorities were not quite one and the same at that point, but they sure overlapped a lot, like 90%, 80%. So Salieri's intent, though, was not to have him be a great librettist. He needed somebody to work on the really bad librettos that were done. And again, keep in mind, in Vienna at that time period, operas were as ubiquitous as the combination of TV movies, sitcoms, and films are today. People went to them 2-3 times a week. That was the grand entertainment. De Ponte was there to fix the ones that didn't work, basically. But he was a smart man. And he learned and he began to study not just the ones he was working on, but the ones that succeeded by other writers. And eventually, he gets introduced to this young musician named Mozart. They're introduced by another converso, by a duke who had converted as well for purely business commercial reasons, knew Mozart, had actually housed Mozart and given him apartments in Vienna. And they worked together, and their first creation does become The Marriage of Figaro.
Wow. Good first shot out of the box.
Right. And Figaro, to those of you not aware of it, Figaro is the probably oldest opera that has been in continuous production for 225, 30 years now, since it first came out. The theme song, Non più andrai, not the theme song, but the Non più andrai, is the theme for the Coldstream Guard at Buckingham Palace. They play it all the time. And it became a hit there a year after its first production in Vienna. These two guys knew what they were doing. They worked together almost seamlessly. They're very highly creative. After the success of Figaro, but I should say, it did not succeed in Vienna at first. One of the things Mozart and De Ponte were doing was making fun of the aristocracy. And
Quite revolutionary for its time.
Very much does that. And so after initially going and attending and liking the music, they kind of stayed away. However, when it premiered in Prague, it was a smash hit. Prague was not as an aristocratic city. It was more of a business, middle class, commercial town, and they absolutely loved it. The theater owner at that point, or the director of the National Theater in Prague, then hired Mozart to do another opera the following year. Mozart turned to De Ponte and said, let's do something. De Ponte said, I got an idea, Don Giovanni. A year later, they're performing Don Giovanni in Prague, which I was fortunate enough to see in Prague 2 years ago at the Estates Theater, the exact same theater where it premiered, also the same theater that was used in Amadeus. So when you see Tom Holtz raising his arms, conducting, that's the Estates Theater in Prague. It's one of the oldest theaters still standing. It's a lovely, small, cozy, intimate setting. There's even a plaque on the floor where Mozart sat when he conducted. Don Giovanni, again, another smash hit in Prague. Not so much initially in Vienna. Same problem, making fun of the aristocracy. And Mozart in his life goes through a very hard time financially, overspending what he earns. De Ponte, however, is a huge success. He writes in his life another 27 operas for various composers, many of which are big hits in Vienna with Martin y Soler and so forth, a few of which you can still hear today. There are a couple of Spanish language versions, actually Italian, but produced in Spain, I should say, of Martin y Soler's operas that De Ponte wrote, and they're fairly good. Soler was not as good a composer as Mozart, obviously, so they didn't live into the repertoire, but they're still very high quality, and the stories work. That's what counts.
So what made De Ponte such a wonderful librettist?
Excuse me?
What made De Ponte such a wonderful librettist? I mean, Mozart even writes, before they worked together, he wrote to his father how he wasn't sure if he would get him because Salieri was going to hog him up, or just going to keep him to himself. But we're so lucky that he didn't.
Absolutely. Salieri was like a sponge, though. He was a totally self-educated, self-directed man. He loved to read. He read all the Latin classics. He read everything he got his hands on. He read the Betty. Although the key link that united the two of them was the Italian poet and librettist for the Habsburg court, who died not long after De Ponte arrived there, no connection to him killing him, a la Don Giovanni, Piero Metastasio. Metastasio's operas, libretti, were converted to something like 500 operas. Mozart, his final opera, was a Metastasio libretto, The Mercy of Titus, that was redone by a friend of De Ponte's, since De Ponte had been kicked out by that time, once again. They both knew Metastasio's work as young people. De Ponte's father was a leather worker. And one of the things he did in the ghetto as a leather worker was binding books. One of the books he bound was Metastasio's collected works. And before his father would deliver these to the patron who wanted that book, Lorenzo would sneak up to the attic as a young boy. Even though he'd never been taught to read, he taught himself to read. He would read, and he loved Metastasio. And by sheer coincidence, Mozart got to meet Metastasio as a 12, 13-year-old in Vienna. He loved his libretto as well. And there's even one more coincidence, which I play with in the novel. The night of January 27th, 1771. Mozart is 15 that day. De Ponte is 22. They are both in Venice the same day, and possibly may have crossed paths, because Metastasio's operas were playing at the Teatro San Benedetto in Venice, which later burns down. And it's possible it may have crossed paths in costume, which is a scene I play with in the novel, having them meet, having them discuss Metastasio. But neither one actually knows who the other is until they meet 10 years later in Vienna. And at that point, they realize they had met, and they go back to Metastasio and his work.
What do you have to say about the idea of the librettist of the opera being the unsung hero? Is there a correlation to that in screenwriting?
Very much so. There's a famous story of one writer, again, I'm terrible. I'm also blanking on his name. I know Ernest Lehman, who wrote many of the Hitchcock movies. We all think of them as Hitchcock movies. And then one day Ernie walks into Hitchcock's office. He's furious at getting ignored all the time. And he throws a blank script, 120 pages on Hitchcock's desk. And he goes, "Direct that, you fool." And, Hitchcock is nothing without a great script. No director is, and no opera composer is. And that's one of my personal gripes with the opera world, two in fact. One is librettists never get credit. They're sort of ignored. Most people don't even know who wrote Mozart's operas. And even one book I bought a number of years ago for these three operas had Mozart's operas. You had to dig into the book to see De Ponte's name. I'll even add to that. It's a fascinating twist. During the Nazi era in Germany, all Mozart's operas were only performed in German. And rather than credit Lorenzo de Ponte as a librettist, because he was a Jew, even though he was a converso and a Catholic priest, the only credit they would give would be to the German translator. So you'd see music by Mozart, libretto by whichever the translator was into German for that particular one.
Isn't it interesting that even the great composers, without good source material and a cohesive libretto, the whole opera falls apart?
Well, again, if you think even Mozart, he wrote, 12, 13 different operas, however you count them. And the three with De Ponte are recognized as being absolutely brilliant. Certainly Figaro and Don Giovanni are always in everybody's top 10. Cozy probably in the top 25 or thereabouts. I'm not going to argue specifics, it's not that important. But you look at his other operas, other than the Magic Flute, which is an enchantment all of its own, you don't really see his other operas rising to that level. You'll see a little bit of Escape from the Seraglio, but not that many others of his work. And yet, and part of it is because the librettos weren't that good. Even Verdi struggles, and Verdi is my next author.
Oh, exciting.
Echo. But, there's a lot of his dramas that don't really work or don't hold up because the chaos of the script, the libretto, is just doesn't make it hold up.
And even great music like Forza del Destino, which is such a great score and great overture and great arias, sometimes without the cohesive libretto and the artistic gel holding it together, it doesn't hold up as a dramatic work in its entirety.
Completely, yeah. Actually, that's the one I'm about to plunge into. Actually taking a class with a good friend of mine, Simon Williams, next week on that very opera. And it's chaos. The story makes no sense. It doesn't hold up. Even some of his great operas, the story very
comes
sketchy.
To mind.
Yeah. And you have to be able to make those willing leaps from one, time frame to another time frame, and just not worry about the information you didn't get in between, which even took me as a writer a long time to accept. My other quick dig on the opera world is I hate the fact they do not translate every line of the songs when you're watching the crawl. And it's because as a writer, I want to know if those lyrics are performed differently than they were 5 minutes ago. I'm not fluent in Italian. I know a little bit. I know some German a little bit, but I can't follow in song and opera well enough. So I want to be able to watch the actors, the singers, to see if they're actually changing how they're presenting the affect of that song with the words. Which, for that reason, I love watching opera when it's made into films. For example, Losi's film from the 1970s of Don Giovanni is perfect. In movies, there's a tendency to translate every word. So you don't have to think, what was the repeat? What was he really saying? Why is she smiling? Why is she frowning? You see it and it's there because most of us don't speak foreign languages. So
true. And even if you speak a language fluently, when it's sung, you may only get 60% of it because of the nature of singing over an orchestra and the live performance aspect.
I mean, when I listen to an English piece, I also miss 80% of it because they're singing and changing the intonations of the words. So yeah, I always want to see it as much as possible. To me, that's
So now, what's it like taking a historical figure and one of such an interesting, colored, checkered past like Da Ponte, who met so many interesting people, did so many things in Venice, then in Vienna, then in London, and then coming to the States, and had such a wild and crazy life. What's it like turning that into a work of fiction? So we have historically inspired music performance. Now I love historically inspired fiction.
right. Well, let me just say first, as a writer, when you're writing historical fiction, you have to know the era. So that's one set of research. When you're writing historical fiction about a specific person, you have to know their life and the life of everybody who interacts with them. So if I'm really writing about Da Ponte, I had to study Mozart. I had to study all of the other historical figures, Joseph II, the Habsburg Emperor. You had to know all of that, know the era, and then you have to know the music. I would spend umpteen hours constantly re-listening to the operas in every different version I could find, going to operas, listening to the music, having it on in the background when I'm working constantly to really get inundated in that era. But then you have to figure, all right, how do I tackle this subject? It's like right now I have no clue how I'm going to tackle Verdi, but I do know what attracted me to him. I know what attracted me to Beethoven, and I know what attracted me to Da Ponte and Mozart. For Verdi, it's obviously the intersection of politics, the Risorgimento, and his personal relationships. And I probably will end that story around 1860 or so, when he marries Sorponi and the Risorgimento accomplishes its first major step. But back to Beethoven, I was struck by reading the story of Beethoven's death. For those who don't know, Beethoven was 56, almost 57, when he died in 1827. He'd been sick for months on end. He'd been confined to his bed. And in the last month of his life, he's in and out of a coma. He's solid coma for 2 days at the end of March. There's a snowstorm, thunderstorm, concurrent going on right outside, and a bolt of lightning strikes his window. Beethoven all of a sudden sits up, eyes open, shakes his hand at the heavens, and then collapses dead. Now, it's a great dramatic thing. You can't make that stuff up. It's real. But it struck me as strange. I had a near-death experience when I was 21, almost 50 years ago now, on a motorcycle accident when I was going to school overseas in Singapore. I somersaulted through an intersection after being hit by a car. My body was shattered. I still have a lot of arthritis and joint pains from that incident so many decades ago. But in the moment of flying through the air, that near-death experience was actually rather peaceful and relaxing and calm. And I wondered, if I was calm, why was Beethoven angry? And that's the question that set me off. What would it take to bring Beethoven to peace at the moment of his death? So that novel unfolds on two levels, almost like a concerto. The solo voice is Beethoven, who in first person, he has just literally woken up. He's staring at the heavens. And in that instant, his entire life passes before him. And he meets what he thinks is Napoleon in his vision, but really it's his own mind playing tricks with him, who becomes the fulcrum character that makes him look at the failings of his life and attempt to come to peace with those. And if he does come to peace with those, he will be rewarded by being able to hear the Ninth Symphony. That's interwoven in a chronologic story with what I call the rest of the orchestra, which are third-person continuing story elements from all the major people who actually were in his life. Again, had to know all of those people. The Archduke Rudolph, who was he? What was he? What was he about? So each chapter alternates between that third-person look back from his friends, his lovers, his people, and Beethoven traveling in what I call Elysium, trying to actually get to Elysium and find paradise, at the same time coming to grips.
How long did it take to do your research for Beethoven and Love? And that came out 5 years ago, right?
The initial was 5 years ago. We did a revised copy, came out last year with a few corrections. the research beginning was a solid 2 years. I realized in the beginning that we know or have documented almost everything about his life. You can't make up a lot of stuff about his life without knowing the facts. I read every single one of his letters to and from him. There's 6 volumes. I read them probably 5 times over. Half a
It's
dozen,
amazing. I've read them all. They're wonderful.
yeah, half a dozen different biographies, umpteen performances of all of his music, and discovering tons of little pieces, obscure pieces that I might never have heard before. Even when I would do public readings, I would often combine with the musician, and we would do alla danza tedesca on a piano version, or I did a flute and cello version once for one reading. I mean, to get to all those little secrets and those gems that he wrote. But anyway, the key was to find the man and then to figure out how to bring him to joy, find his one day of joy.
Who are some of the favorite scholars and biographies that you read?
Oh, God. I mean, I have a bookshelf full of every major biography, every note written about him, not musical, but about the man himself.
Sure.
Because I'm not a musician. I love music, and I wish I could play music. I often joke that I can conduct, play the violin, the guitar, and the piano one-handed perfectly while driving. And I've never, ever made a mistake in all that time. But to play a real instrument, nah, not going to happen. But again, it's finding the person and trying to do that. And also, when you're writing first person Beethoven, you really have to get into his head. And the only way to do that is to constantly reread his letters, start to get a sense of his syntax, and to try to read some of them in German, which I know German fairly well, though I'm no longer fluent, but to, again, get a sense of the man. And at the same time, not get married to the exact wording of the letters. Because if you and I told the same story about what happened this morning at work to 5 different people, we would describe it similarly, but in different words. We never use the exact words. And Beethoven was the same thing. He's describing or writing a letter to somebody about his hearing, about a story he may have told half a dozen other times. It's always going to be a little bit different. But take that forward to Mozart, and really De Ponte was my key. I really wanted to know who he was. And again, the trigger was finding this man, this writer, basically, who's also learned how to survive, who was born Jewish, had a Casanova life, was converted to a different religion. And there were a lot of parallels. I can't say exact parallels. I don't want to over-exaggerate the similarities, but we had very similar lives. And he also spent the last half of his life, 33 years, in New York City. I was born in the city. I grew up on Long Island. I'm an East Coaster by core. I'm a diehard Yankee fan to this day. But
we won't hold that against you. I'm a Mets fan, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, and I've been to Shea too, years ago. Not City Field, but Shea. Anyway, so there was a lot of similarities there. And it's like, what was it like for him? And I'm a secular Jew. I'm not a religious Jew at all. What was it like for him to grow up in that environment where he never actually did, in the course of his life, escape anti-Semitism? Now, in his romantic life, he would date women all the time. I think that he probably used confession as a means to find the women he wanted to date in Venice. He was truly a cad at that age, a young man. And he would often say, I can't marry, I'm a priest. Yet when he's 40 years old and he's actually been thrown out of Vienna, he needs to find a new place to live. He ends up marrying a young woman who he had known apparently in secret for a number of years, who was also a converso. And they sneak back into the Veneto. He was forbidden to be in the Veneto. He's been expelled. But they sneak back in to be with their families, which are from that area. And he gets married, supposedly, and this is not 100% confirmed, by a rabbi. 40 years old. Then he's off to London for 12 years, and then finally New York for the last 33 years. But he never, ever openly talks about being a Jew and what that is. And yet, even though he was a priest, everyone knew he was a converso. He didn't talk about it. Other people did behind his back. And many of the antagonisms and the enemies he would encounter exacerbated by the fact that he was Jewish, those encounters. He gets to New York. He is cautioned, said, you don't want to be Jewish here either. This is the early 1800s, New York was still a highly anti-Semitic environment, especially among the upper classes that he knew. And so he hid it. And to represent this in the novel, I had his yod, which is a little brass pointer that he might have been given when he was doing his bar mitzvah. Yod is what you use to read the Torah at your bar mitzvah. And you use the metal pointer so your body oils never get onto the actual paper or skin that the Torah is written on. I think it's lambskin or something like that. In some cases, parchment. And I hypothesized that he kept that his whole entire life as the one symbol of his childhood. And we also know that he wrote his diary in 4 or 5 volumes. And there's been rumors that one of those volumes was missing. And since in his actual, what I call the public diaries, he never once mentions being Jewish. He also never mentions anything about being a Catholic priest other than he is, nothing about the theology or so forth. I presuppose and hypothesize, what if there was a secret diary that he wrote all of his experiences about being Jewish in all of those years, and that he wanted to write because it was important to him, yet he couldn't show publicly. And that, again, it was also rumored that he sent these materials, which he wrote in Italian, because he's much more fluent as a writer in Italian, back to his family, which was still living in, the Veneto. And in the novel, I presuppose a young Italian-American GI, a Jew who's stationed at Aviano Air Base after the war, who gets leave to go with one of his friends, a British lieutenant, to go see one of the first operas after the war in Treviso. And it's January 27th, Mozart's birthday. He loves Mozart. His whole family loves Mozart's music. And on this journey, they never make it to Treviso. He ends up in the village where his family came from in Italy, which is the village of Cineta, which is where De Ponte grew up. And in this journey, he not only is gifted the secret diary, he discovers very distant relatives, or one in particular, who he ends up marrying, and the rest are all dead and murdered in the Holocaust. That village was basically raised, the Jewish ghetto was raised during the war by the Nazis. The woman he finds was a partisan during the war. And so together, they move back to New York, and they casually, over the years, begin to translate the diaries to English. And it's a side project. She's a translator for the UN. He works for an agency that he was working in intelligence, Army intelligence. He ends up working for an agency that becomes part of the CIA. And his particular mission is to track down the escaped Nazis early on. But he's an opera lover. His son becomes an opera singer. And the plot goes on from there.
So the praise for the story has been, if this novel has been great. I'll give you a couple of these. The renowned author Patricia Morrisroe writes, Howard J. Smith has written the musical equivalent of the Da Vinci Code, deftly plotted and richly detailed. The novel spans generations, about Mozart, mysteries, masquerades, operas, spies, and much more. So high praise also from Jan Swafford, the known scholar and author. She writes, an entertaining tale inspired by Mozart and his operas, aimed especially towards Mozart lovers. Its mingling of fact and fancy includes a memorable portrait of Mozart's raffish and brilliant librettist. So high praise indeed.
I was really happy about that, I got to tell you.
Should be.
That's become the log line that my publisher jumped on, the musical equivalent of Da Vinci Code. It's on the back of the book. And it's in almost every bit of promo that gets put out there. It was delightful. And Jan, he's the scholar. I mean, he's done Beethoven, 1,000 pages of Brahms, and 1,000 pages of his Mozart book, which also just came out this past month. Getting that, plus a lot of other writers have weighed in on that. It's been a great thrill. I mean, as I said, my career started 40 years ago back in the literary world of John Irving, Toni Morrison, John Gardner, and it took a huge detour through screenwriting and so forth. And so over the past years since the Beethoven book came out, I've sort of gotten back into that literary world of writers again and crossing paths with them. So it's been a huge blessing to have these other people like the work and drawn by it.
What's it like to have people all over the world commenting on your books? And these are two figures that all musicians love, of course, and are kind of on that pedestal of almost immortality. What's it like to get letters from people who are touched by these books and stories?
It's fun and it's a challenge at the same time because again, these are people we know a lot about. You make a misstep here and you're going to hear about it. My very first reading, public reading of the Beethoven novel 5 years ago was at the American Beethoven Society 30th Annual Convention. And here I am reading a work of fiction to a group of Beethoven experts. I was terrified. But I got there and I read my chapter and they loved it. A couple of years later, a friend of mine asked me to submit a story for an award, and I submitted a chunk of the Beethoven. That was the Foundation Award for Literary Excellence. So that was kind of cool. You never know how it is, but it does go, in a sense, to one of the things about writing in general. And I taught writing for 5 years, and it's really important to me. And the lessons I learned from my mentor, John Gardner, are essential. And the single most important lesson he said, and one I shared with every student I ever had, was simply this. And John used to say, when you're creating a story, what you're doing is creating a vivid and continuous dream in the reader's mind that is so overwhelming, so powerful, and so all-encompassing in their mind that the next thing they know, someone's calling them to dinner. The caveat, though, is that anything you write that breaks that dream, no matter how brilliant or wonderful you think it is, it's no good. Throw it out. So you really have to edit with a constant eye towards holding the reader's attention on what you want them to see. Screenwriting, you learn that because it is visual art. You have to put the thing on the screen. So when you bring that back to writing a novel, I think it makes you a better writer. And I think I'm a far better writer having taught for 5 years than I was before because I reinforced my own lessons, so to speak, with my students, and they would reflect it back in their own work. So that was also really critical to be able to do that. And so writing a story like this, as mentioned earlier, everything that's in there has a reverberation somewhere. And yet, just like a good musician, you never repeat it exactly the same way. It's always comes from a different direction and a surprise, hopefully.
Or it's orchestrated differently with slightly shading the harmonies different. There's so many ways to do that.
Right,
like
absolutely.
Beethoven and Mozart.
You know that as a conductor, you see the scores, you see what they're doing. And writing, you're telling a story. Same with composing a symphony. You're telling, not literally a story, but you're telling a mood. You're trying to convey something. You're trying to communicate. If you're not communicating to your audience, you're not accomplishing your goal. So to have people respond to this has been thrilling. And literally, it is all over the world, which is one of the beauties of this electronic era. I have friends now in Vienna, friends in Southeast Asia. I was even working on something, the story I mentioned to you earlier about the Nazis suppressing Mozart and De Ponte's name. I happened to do a class that I gave about 3 months ago on Mozart and De Ponte. And one of the people listening happened to be in, I think, Vietnam or Cambodia at the time, an American. And he emails back to me afterwards and says, there's this whole thing about how the Nazis treated him, which was not really a part of my book. My book begins after the war, though it does reference what happened during the war. And there's a book, Mozart and the Nazis, 300 pages, which I immediately got a hold of and read through. And it confirmed a lot of the things I had guessed. Had I read it before, I would have even made some of these connections with the attack on his village, home village, even more poignant and personal. But it was all there. And so what you're trying to do in a novel is to weave together seamlessly the facts you know to be true and the fiction you want to create so that the reader is always wondering at the end, what's real, what's not real, and maybe, just maybe, it'll motivate them to read more, learn more from all sources about the people you're writing about.
Whenever I read a great novel, and I always find those side avenues, I'm always fascinated. Like, did that actually happen that way? So I always dig in there and finding the books to follow up on, and that's how you know a book really has something special to say.
Right. Even with the Beethoven, I put an appendix in the back of all the books from all the different topics I had used to write it, not just the Beethoven biographies, but all the things that reflected on it. So if somebody wants to say, oh, what is this about Asian philosophy and Beethoven's diaries? Well, one, the diaries are there. Two, the source material, Bhagavad Gita in that particular case, is there. And you can read a lot more about it if you wanted. Um, did not do that with the Mozart. It's just too much work to do with it. Mozart to Ponte, but it's all there. And
how hard was it to actually publish a work during the COVID era? Because I know I've spoken to so many musicians and people in the music publishing industry, and they said that the industry is almost at a standstill until live performance starts again. Are we seeing similar times in the publishing industry for books and novels?
It is similar, but I think it's also exacerbating what has been a massive transformation of the publishing world in the past, I would say 10, 15 years, where it has completely changed from where it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. There are very few major publishing houses anymore. There are fewer agents. Agents can simply not afford to take on new writers. They're too concerned about a paycheck themselves. When I was in Hollywood, the agents I knew would say, look, I need to have 20 working screenwriters to cover my expenses and my overhead as a member of my agency. That's a lot. They don't have a lot of time for newcomers. That has become even more prominent in the publishing world. Unless you're pushing something out there that's a pop topic, we used to joke, oh, I'll write the Kennedy sex diet because it's the 3 most popular topics. At the time, nobody wants to talk to you. If it's more than 250 pages, it costs more to ship. They don't want to talk to you. So a lot of issues and problems with that. And it just massively transformed. However, what do writers do? We sit in front of our computers, we write. COVID has not affected that at all. We're still home writing. I mean, I finished the novel in August and been working on it for about 2 years. Actually 2 years from almost today, when I actually started the writing of it. So a year and a half, of which 6 months was during lockdown. And communicating with other writers, with publishers, it's still emails, it's still phone calls. So that aspect was not directly affected. It's more directed probably by the news right now and politics. You know, everybody's focused on the impeachment and the transition of power in this country. So
the sequel,
a lot
part
of
2
open space are the things to happen right now.
We're on the sequel, the impeachment part 2.
Right. 2. Right.
So what's the next step for you? Do you have any books in mind that are not musical topics, or are you really loving this music topic so much?
I'm loving the music. For me, I did not really get involved in listening to opera. My first opera was maybe 20 years ago when I was at the Met and I heard the Italian in Algiers. And then I only really got into seriously studying it when I started the Beethoven and had to research Fidelio and the music that's the other thing, you do historical novels. What did they listen to? So Beethoven listened to a lot of Mozart. They got me more turned on to the Mozart operas, and I did a deep dive in those. And I said, now it's Verdi and his time period. So it's Donizetti, it's Bellini, it's everybody else, it's Puccini. You've got to know them all to be able to write accurately about the overall time and place, and also the progression of the art form. I think I mentioned earlier that opera was, in that era, was like the TV movie and TV sitcoms of its day. It was constant. And you also begin to realize that audiences who listened to opera knew them so well that you did not have to tell every single little bit of the plot, that you could make the kind of leaps you see in a Madame Butterfly or in other Puccini works. That audience could go there. They were not confused. They accepted it. It's the same thing with film now, where films are so much faster than they were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Audiences have seen so much that they're willing to jump and leap with you. And you have to know that about each era. Why is this one more detailed? Why is this one less detailed? Well, they're written 150 years apart. That's why. So it all makes a huge difference in that way.
Might any of your books be turned into screenplays in the future?
It's always possible. Somebody wants to buy it. I've often joked with my producer friends, and numbers of them wrote nice reviews. I said, look, I spent enough time working in Hollywood. It is one, even though it's one of the worst places in the world to work. Um, and which
It
I
was the
mentioned,
best of
you know,
times. It was the worst of
nobody goes
times.
to Hollywood. You can sell. And I've often said, look, if you want my book for a movie, do not ask me to write the screenplay. It's going to take someone else with a different imagination than mine to transfer a novel into a film. It's the same thing with Amadeus. It became a brilliant movie. It's highly inaccurate, but it's a brilliant movie. It's one of the best movies ever made.
Wonderful entertainment, absolutely.
But yeah, but it's going to take that vision. So if you want it, pay me, first thing. Two, give me a credit that if it happens to win an Academy Award, I get to go on stage. Three, I'll serve as a technical consultant, and I consider myself a knowledgeable person. I'm not an expert, but a highly knowledgeable person. I'll be a consultant, and I want zero creative control. Let somebody else take it, run with it, make it their vision, both the screenwriter and the producer, and come up with something that's magical. And if it's really bad, I'll take my name off it, but I've still gotten paid. If it's really good, I'll be on stage to get the Oscar. Simple.
So I hear there's a really wonderful artist attached with both of your books. Tell us about the cover art and some of the pictures that are in it.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate. My son, who was as much a prodigy as both Beethoven and Mozart, is a brilliant artist. He's in 9 museums around the world, including MoMA in New York, the Met, the Whitney, the Walker in Pittsburgh, National Portrait Gallery, Saatchi in London. Anyway, being my son, I got him to do, excuse me, the cover for the Beethoven book, which is Beethoven's Immortal Beloved. It's Beethoven dreaming of that woman, and the woman is sort of in his brain coming out of his hair. But for this one, he actually did not just the cover, but he also did 12 other pictures in there, which in the ebook version are actually in color. In the print book, we couldn't do color. It's far too expensive. And I probably have the equivalent of a couple $100,000 worth of art in this book as well that, in paperback, it's going to cost you $24. So I'm really blessed to have Zach do that work for me. And the art themselves, the pictures themselves are just stunning.
Zach's professional name is Zach Smith?
Zach Smith, yeah, Z-A-K.
And we can find his information on his website, or is there a...
At his gallery, Friedrichsreiser in New York. And his, on my Facebook and my posts and so forth, things like that, his gallery is listed there too, yeah.
Wonderful. And how can we find out more about your work? Where was your website, or how can I think Amazon certainly lists your books. I'm looking at them now. Amazon
lists both my books, but they're available, especially the Mozart is available anywhere. Any bookseller can get it for you. It's Meeting Mozart is the title. The original title was Meeting Mozart in Venice, Vienna, and Prague from the Secret Diaries of Lorenzo da Ponte. Again, it's da Ponte's view of this world, and what happens as they meet, as they work together. And again, it's available anywhere. And if you really love it and you want an autographed copy, I can't get you an autographed copy, but if you post a picture of you holding that book, I will print it, sign the picture, and send it back to you in some fashion electronically.
How can people get in touch with you if they have any? Do you touch base with your audience often?
Through Facebook. I have a Facebook page, Howard J. Smith. They can send me comments there. They can look up my stuff there. Things are posted. Don't have a website that I actively use anymore. Seem to be fairly redundant with Facebook. And always happy to talk to people who've read the book. And I've often tell people, I'm always curious to hear feedback, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. You don't learn unless you hear what people have to say, and you can't be afraid. At this age, I've got a really thick skin. There's nothing anybody could say that's going to truly hurt me about my writing.
What's some of the stories that have come out of the response from the audience, them that you've were touched by?
It's just been at this point very early on, but a lot of my first initial readers are fans who read the Beethoven book, and they love this one even more, is what I can tell you for sure. And again, these are people all over the world who can read English. Maybe eventually we'll get a translator for roughly German and Italian versions of it at some point. And I probably will try to do an audio version as well down the road. But again, it's an ebook, it's in print, you can get it anywhere. I would add too that we talk about other people. For example, with the Beethoven, the great grandson of the woman who was thought to be the immortal beloved, Giulietta Gicardi, he got in touch with me a few years ago. Christmas that year, I had to send his mother, who has a picture of herself with the statue of Giulietta, a copy of the book for her Christmas present, and signed it as someone who, here again, 200 years later, our family histories are once again crossing.
Isn't that amazing about art, how that can cross those boundaries, and we can make those connections to the past?
Yeah. I've also gotten to communicate regularly with William Lobkowitz, who was the 7th generation descendant of Prince Lobkowitz, who supported Beethoven. And he has a magnificent museum in Prague that I suggest everybody see. There was one music room devoted almost entirely to antique instruments, but more importantly, about a dozen of the original scores for the 4th, 5th, 6th symphony. I mean, you walk into this room, it's like seeing the holy grail of Beethoven material. And so, connections like that are priceless and also enriched because they also dealt with Mozart, many of them, and Ponte. So it's an ongoing exploration. It's a fun journey. And every time I travel somewhere, we always plan it around going to an opera, going to a concert, learning more, seeing some of these great classic theaters in Europe. And we were supposed to be back there this past summer, but obviously got canceled. And we're still hoping maybe in the next, 6 to 10 months, we might get to travel again and repeat those journeys that we wanted to do, or do those journeys we wanted to do before. And just watch great music and see great performers.
Howard, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we wish you all the best as your Verdi research comes together with your book.
I love the show. You guys are doing a great thing. I would say one last thing to the musicians and artists who are struggling at this point. It's very similar to the writer's strike we went through in the late 80s. It was a full year out of our life. And it will change the industry. It will change how things go. But there is life after this. And that's what we have to remember. And those of us who dedicated and continue doing the work will eventually be back on stage. And we will eventually be back in the audience listening to you because we love you.
Howard, thank you so much for those sage words. And we all need to hear those these days. And to hear from you was really special. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Much appreciate this being on the show today. Thank you, Stan.
And when your book comes out, the Verdi book, I want you back on the show.
Well, that's going to be a couple of years down the road because I don't even know where I'm starting with. So we'll do that, too.
Thank you for joining us on Music Matters with Jason Tramm. And please remember to subscribe to us and smash that bell icon for the most up-to-date information and upcoming guests and topics. Our next guest will be this Sunday. It'll be Michelle Johnson, a wonderful dramatic soprano who is singing all over the world. And even during COVID, she's been doing some really fascinating projects. So she'll be on at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on Sunday. We appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to us on YouTube and like our videos. And thank you. Remember, keep music alive. Good night.